so much for joining our training webinar tonight. It's a weekly webinar of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provide CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'll be your host tonight, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is all about engaging challenging conversations about the Energy Permitting Reform Act. Given the wide array of responses that the climate advocacy community has had with the introduction of the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024, tonight's training is going to really provide volunteers with a supportive mindset and some resources that we've built out to respond to questions earnestly and openly. We'll review an updated resource to help with some of the general guidance and perspective on how to respectfully engage with others who have critiques regarding one of CCL's policy agenda areas in permitting reform. And we're also going to bring in a community engagement expert that I will actually introduce here with our next slide to really speak to a lot of your questions that you might have, because I know that's been on the hearts and minds of a lot of our CCLers. And so joining me tonight will be the wonderful Flannery Winchester, CCL's Vice President of Communications. We'll also be hearing a lot from Emily Green, Earth and Equity's Social and Stakeholder Engagement Specialist, who has a lot of practical and grounded experience in these types of issues in the real world. So the lineup's going to be really straightforward. I'm just going to quickly provide a bit of a background on where to find this updated resource and some helpful links and instructions on locating it for those listening in later. I'll then give a little bit of an overview. The framework that we're using, again, is really all about relationship development, and we're not trying to convince somebody with one conversation that our perspective is correct. We're trying to engage in a dialogue to understand their worldviews, their perspective, their values, and have the chance to really think through and talk together about what perspectives are and what we're bringing to the table. We'll then have the chance to learn from Emily's background, especially within the realm of community engagement, some examples from the real world. So first and foremost, obviously, because this is a topic is emerging and continuing to be updated, we have developed a new resource that is all about handling challenging questions, and that's really one of the goals of what we wanted to talk through tonight. And so let me put that in the chat. And basically, I'll show you. It's findable under our resource directory. You can also search for handling challenging questions. It's under our lobbying Congress section. Right here in the drop-down menu, you can see handling challenging questions. I put a link to it in the chat. We'll make sure to put a link to this resource in the notes. But what this resource does is provide both a sense of background as far as really our overall recommendations on how to approach challenging conversations. And then after that, we're going to hear from Flannery about some of the specific areas that it dives into. And then that will tie very neatly into the work that Emily does as a professional around community engagement, since that's a big piece of what's on a lot of our minds as well for any of these kinds of policies and their impacts. And I also just want to throw out another wonderful resource that has been recently developed, is not only our traditional trainings and resources, but also a more interactive format, and how we can really learn from the clean energy permitting reform perspective in an interactive training format. And so that's a resource that we'll also put in the liner notes for tonight's training. If you haven't checked that one out yet, that's recently been added to our training catalog in the clean energy permitting reform policy agenda area. Wanted to make sure to just name that, and especially give a big shout out to Tamara and Rich and Linda, her whole team that she's got developing those for their great work. All right, so with that, let me just do a brief overview of 4 essential frames before passing it over to Flannery to talk through some of the specific examples that you'll see in this resource that we've created. But the biggest thing that we want to start with, like we do with any conversation as CCLers, is just grounding ourselves in the importance of listening. As we know, this isn't just a strategic choice. I mean, obviously, people are more likely to be open to what we have to say once they feel like they've been listened to. But it's also an essential skill that we can bring to any conversation that we bring, just for the sake of relationship development and to have the chance to practice skills around reflective listening. So you'll see in this resource bank, we made specific recommendations on how, with any of these dialogues, you can engage by starting with any conversation and restating the question or the comment that you've heard so that you can make sure that you understand it. And you can also then, from that, be more prepared to articulate places of agreement with your conversational partner's values or concerns when possible, and to really use those to bring them into the conversation. Something like, it sounds to me like effectiveness is an important part of any solution for you. And then obviously also using those same listening skills to be able to resonate or agree with their values if they happen to be the ones that you share. Effectiveness is also very important to me as well, you might say. And then being able to continue, with other frames, we've got some recommendations on next steps like this might not satisfy you, but for me, one thing I like about the bill is dot dot dot. And then having the chance to really open up and dialogue kind of through some of those discussions. And like we talk about in the resource, this is definitely more of an opportunity, especially a lot of the resource bank is built around one-on-one or small group conversations rather than large public presentations or, dialogues and forums. But in either case, really the whole opening framework that we want to engage in is conveying an honest curiosity and openness to whoever our conversational partner might be and the values and the framework and perspective that they're bringing. Another really key question early on in any of these conversations that I think is really just important to ask is just, is it even needed or necessary to respond? There's some cases where your best option might not be really to engage in a further discussion, and to really acknowledge kind of their perspective and move on. For instance, obviously, one of the things that we're already, training ourselves as climate advocates for is realizing where and when to stop, when in a discussion with somebody that, really has a strong disbelief in climate change, overall, that being, rarely productive, especially in a more public setting. So in some cases, again, we just want to encourage you to, pick up on your senses. It can be best to ignore, deflect, or, make your own judgment on whether or not you really feel like you need to force the conversation. And I think, the other key thing that we want to name here is that there are national organizations, that we are even traditional allies with in other areas within, the overall climate movement that are firmly opposed to obviously this specific bill. And that's entirely all right. That's up to any individual's autonomous belief on that. And, that happens to be, organizations that align more traditionally on the left or the right. And I think it's just important to name that CCL staff is also working on the national level with many of these organizations through networks they're a part of or groups that we happen to, show up in space with. And so the relationships, on the local level are probably on the national level is probably as good and strong as they can be. And on the local level, it's something certainly, where if you have the chance to engage still, if somebody opens up by saying, I heard organization X says this about the bill, you're more than welcome to still engage them on the topic, just being respectful of obviously the fact that, their organization is really important too. And we don't want to disparage or, put down other organizations for having a different stance on this. One other thing on this, do you need a respond point that I think is just really important to name out loud is that online forums or email threads are some of the worst places for dialogue. So don't give in to the temptation to correct every person who said something wrong on the internet. Oftentimes, this is a great example of where it's probably just best to let it go and focus on spreading your own positive message and engagement in places where you feel like you can actually be more productive. The next thing I wanted to just name here, and that the resource does a good job of walking through, is just reminding us all that context matters, right? So how you engage is different in the different situations that you might find yourself in these conversations. One-on-one, presentations, with the media, during a meeting with community leaders, during a meeting with a congressional office, right? Each of these is going to have their own opportunities or avenues for how you can advance the discussion and make sure to listen and understand their concerns. And the resource does a really good job of being able to help you think through the strengths and the challenges for each of those. And the last thing that I'll say here before passing it to Flannery to demonstrate a few of these specific areas in the Q&A is just emphasizing that we have a very simple to remember, frame in your own words, main message. So when in your words, having the opportunity once you've engaged in dialogue and, had the chance to listen and understand kind of the background and framework or the value set that your conversation partner is describing, you can basically keep your communication simple and high level until obviously there's a chance to dive into any area. But here's one recommendation as far as, how you might define this in 3 sentences. Right now, we know the challenge is that it takes too long to build and connect clean energy projects in our country. But we need those clean energy projects to help us meet our climate goal. That's the challenge setup, right? So the Energy Permitting Reform Act will help get good clean energy projects up and running more quickly so that we can stop the pollution that's overheating our planet. And then the acknowledgement that right now we're focusing on this because it's really what we feel is our best chance in this current Congress to still put America on a path to significantly cutting our climate pollution. Now, the resource has a whole host of other additional supporting points that I won't get into here, but you're more than welcome to explore, that we really feel like are a helpful way to branch out and dive into more dialogue as the conversation unfolds. But I think really the key message with that main focus is just being able to describe the opportunity after we've described the challenge and then how we are focused on it. All right, so with that though, what I'm actually going to do is just briefly pass to Flannery. And Flannery, who's been instrumental in setting up this document and resource with me, is just going to walk through 4 of these scenarios and how this resource kind of helps you think through each of them and how you might respond depending on the questions that you're asked. And then after that, we'll pass it to you, Emily. So here's Flannery.
Hi, everyone. I'm Flannery Winchester, CCL's Vice President of Communications. So, as Brett said, a lot of handling tough questions is about listening well, knowing your audience, having the right messenger, keeping the context in mind. All those pieces are really important. And everything he shared there definitely affects how these conversations go. And something else to keep in mind is that on this particular bill, another element of handling these tough questions is just making sure that folks have accurate information about the legislation and its impacts. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of common questions or themes that we hear about this legislation and how you might respond. So these Q&As are all in a written resource associated with this training tonight, so you can refer to this at any point in the future. So one common question that we get is about the impact of the bill on climate change or on emissions. So, and because this is our handling challenging questions training, we'll phrase these questions in challenging ways. So someone might come to you, or if you're having this conversation, someone might say something like, I saw some numbers that this bill would increase emissions as much as adding 165 coal plants. That's not something that CCL should be supporting. That's not something I support. It's gonna increase emissions. So in that case, you could give an answer like this. We've seen those numbers too, but they're incorrect. That was a rapid, flawed estimate that came out from a group called Simon's Public Affairs in a matter of hours after the bill text was released. But quality, thorough analysis takes a lot longer. So thankfully, the best climate and energy modelers in the business actually did put their heads together to analyze the impacts of this bill. So this is Resources for the Future, Rocky Mountain Institute, Jesse Jenkins from Princeton University's Zero Lab, and a group called Third Way. These are the same modelers who we listened to to understand the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act and other major climate bills, so they're very trusted. And they, about 6 weeks after the bill was introduced, they released their modeling. And in every scenario that they modeled, they found that the bill will lead to a net reduction in America's climate pollution. So in the most likely scenario, their analysis suggests we'll see a 10% reduction in America's total climate pollution by 2050, but it could be as much as a 25% cut. So that's your answer on that, is establishing who the trusted messengers are on the modeling and pointing them toward the experts, and then giving them the numbers that they might not have seen, because again, there was that delay of a few weeks while those modelers really deeply, thoroughly looked at the bill. So you can share that information with them. Another kind of theme or questions that we get in a certain area are about the fossil fuel provisions of the bill. And there's particularly been a lot of discussion about the natural gas elements. So you might hear a question where someone is asking something like, or they're challenging something like, if we don't pass this bill, America won't export any more natural gas, so we shouldn't support this bill. So if you get that type of question, then you can clarify that's actually incorrect. So America is currently the world's biggest natural gas exporter. and LNG, liquid natural gas, LNG exports have continued to increase during 2024. So we're likely to see that trend continue. They're going to keep increasing, whether or not the Energy Permitting Reform Act passes. And in fact, if the bill doesn't pass, we will see increased LNG exports most likely, but without any of the good clean energy infrastructure and transmission that this bill would support, which are going to actually lead to huge emissions cuts. So, on balance, the climate would be better off if Congress passed the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024 and we got that clean energy infrastructure and electric transmission, even with these LNG provisions included. Something else you might need to clarify for folks is that is the President Biden's administration put a temporary pause on LNG exports earlier this year in January. And so there's some confusion out there about if this bill overturns that ban. So we have some language in the resource where you can sort of clarify that's not actually the case. So that's in the resource as well. And a couple other things that come up. So the bill makes some changes to judicial review timelines, and particularly it shortens it to a 5-month timeline, which has been sort of picked up by opposition as like, oh, 5 months sounds like a really short period of time. So you might get a question where people are saying something like, a 5-month timeline for lawsuits is way too short. This is going to hurt communities. This should be longer. So in that case, you can clarify. The bill shortens the statute of limitations for bringing a lawsuit specifically about the decision to issue a permit or not for an energy project. And there's plenty of advance notice on these permitting decisions. But despite that 5-month timeline on the lawsuit for the permitting decision, communities will still have plenty of time to bring lawsuits against projects themselves for any impacts. So those are two different things. And again, this 5-month timeline is just specifically about the decision to issue a permit or not, and there's plenty of advance notice. Something else that might come up is with the mining provisions. So this one is not directly related to climate change. This is more of a local environmental impacts question, but it is part of the bill, so it may come up. And so you might hear a question or a challenge like, this bill lets companies dump toxic waste on federal land. So how do you deal with that? You can clarify. So it sounds like you're referencing the legislation's mining provision. Mining milling activities, so waste disposal, processing of ore, those still have to be included in mining plans that undergo environmental reviews. So this provision of the Energy Permitting Reform Act is not giving mining companies a blank check. Their environmental impacts will still be considered. And then it's also important to note that the mining language in the bill, it was a Democratic provision that not only addresses this question of milling siting, where can those activities happen, but it also funds cleanup efforts for hard rock mining. So that's a positive that a lot of folks are not aware of, and it's good to introduce that and make sure that they know. So that's a look at some of the language we're offering you to start to handle some of these challenging questions and some of these themes that come up around the bill. So hopefully that's helpful for you as you have conversations around this legislation. And if you're hearing other questions that you need help to address, or if you have other questions yourself that we haven't addressed, please let us know those in the CCL community forums over the next few days, weeks, months, so that we can answer your questions, and we can also help equip you with the information and the talking points that you need to have good conversations around this bill. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely helpful. And again, those are just a few of the preview of the areas that we've been trying to provide more resources and links to, and there's certainly more. And the last thing I'll just highlight is if you want to practice this online, the conversation resource that I talked earlier that Tamara's developed with her team now actually does have some actual sample conversations with decision trees, even where you can have the chance to kind of map this out, see how it feels, see which, of the choices you'd make, and, what opens up with your conversational partner with each of those. So definitely just want to give a good plug again to the whole suite of areas that we're trying to put out there. And also know that one of the big areas that, like we talked about at the beginning of the hour, we really want to lean into more tonight is on that community engagement piece. And who better to understand about community engagement than somebody that does that work on a day-to-day basis? So again, we brought in a friend, a colleague, an expert on this matter. And for the next 10, 15 minutes, I'm actually going to pass it over to you, Emily.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hesitate to call myself an expert ever, like ever, but I do appreciate the vote of confidence. My name is Emily Green. I'm with a consulting firm called Earth and Equity, and I would love to just share some background on what got me into community engagement and how I'm using it now through the different levels of engagement that I've done in my life so far. So my background really consists of a lot of local source water protection. I started working with a lot of local conservation commissions, and that ended up with me moving towards more national working groups and initiating collaboratives around land and water conservation and stewardship. That left me kind of wanting for more. So I ended up in global consulting and community health and safety, and which is what I do now. And listening to the beginning part of this presentation, I'm called in to consult, and my colleagues and I, as a team, are called in to consult on community community engagement, community issues, as well as organizations and companies that operate within lands where communities are affected or potentially affected. So I find myself at the intersection of knowledge and stakeholder engagement all the time. My work primarily is centered around mobilizing community decision making. So, really making sure we're empowering communities to make decisions for themselves and facilitating public and private partnerships, which also sort of led me down this very interesting road of always being attracted to conflict conversations and trying to figure out how to resolve or at least come to an agreement on where common ground steps can kind of be taken between communities and organizations. So that is kind of what led me into uh, being a stakeholder engagement specialist with Earth and Equity. So at Earth and Equity, we have a global mission. We call ourselves a boutique consulting firm, meaning that we are very small, but we are highly specialized. And some of the things that we specialize in are looking at social performance standards of companies, really trying to understand what their impacts are on the social environment of communities as well as the physical environmental impacts they might have. Looking at management systems, we try and create structured engagement frameworks, organizational processes for companies and organizations and communities, but mostly organizations that are looking to adhere to compliance obligations, especially in regard to social performance. We also promote resilient communities, again, making sure that communities are heard, not just heard, but can make well informed decisions for themselves. And we also focus very much on conserving biodiversity. So, following environmental safeguards and safeguarding ecosystem services. And equity is at the heart of what we do. It's in our name. We are, again, a small team, but we are mighty. We are women and minority owned. We work with some of the largest oil, gas, and mining companies in the world. And we have a vested interest in making sure that these public private partnerships are maximizing their benefits to communities and safeguarding environmental or ecosystem services. So, I think one of the questions that I get kind of frequently is like, okay, so you've done local, national, global. When you're working with engagement frameworks, what are the differences? What are the similarities? We, the way that we have done our engagement with people, there are a lot of common elements, no matter what level that we're engaging at with communities. One, we want to connect to values. So, what do communities care about? We really need to know what their concerns are, what their needs are. We need to know if there are any challenges to engagement for them, and as far as asserting their values when it comes to things that they care about. And then finding those opportunities where they can assert their values and not just stand up for what they believe in, but make choices for their communities that support their communities. The second thing is we really, and this might be one of the most important things, but truly understanding the social context of the communities that you are going to speak with. And I will also preface all of this with these are not new ideas. These are all things that I have spent my early career, building off of and learning from other people that have really laid out the path for me. So really understanding the social context. Are people able to care? What might exist in terms of historic and current power dynamics in communities? And do those power dynamics influence how marginalized communities are able to participate or able to care? Which can lead to some conflict management. So, when we speak about conflict prevention, I want to know, how much do people care? Do communities care? How much do organizations care? My experience with dealing with conflict or managing it is, whether I step into situations that are in the midst of conflict or even post conflict, the more I realize people care about things. They're passionate. And that oftentimes is a really good sort of launch pad for how you can create common ground or find common ground with people in your community, but also with organizations. And then probably the last one, which is my favorite, is leading with intention. So how much do you care? So how much do I care as a consultant, as a person, and how much do you care as volunteers speaking to your community members? And when I say lead with the intention that you are going to set up, hopefully, what will be a long-lasting relationship. When you have that relationship kind of on a solid foundation, you're better able to make decisions. I think you're better able to share information. And I think overall, people are a little bit more informed when there's a good relationship and everyone can kind of speak with each other and to each other instead of at each other. I wanted to share a very brief example, real life example of how community engagement for us is in action regarding permitting at a mine. So, one of the sites that we work with, the mine distributes their materials globally, and the company needs to get permitting approval from communities. There are, I think, a lot of nuances, but also a lot of devastating impacts that can happen when community engagement is not done well, specifically with regard to permitting. So, I also want to preface this example with the fact that this one in particular, it's not just mining, it's projects everywhere around the world, but there are devastating impacts to communities and the environment. So let's just say that for the sake of this very brief case study, the operations cease completely. And we have seen this. We've seen this happen over and over again, where regional economic devastation happens. So people lose their jobs, local businesses get shut down. We see existing social issues that are exacerbated. So, for example, when the pandemic happened and everybody was stuck at home, we saw increases of domestic violence, of substance use, of self harm. We also saw social inequities increase. Um, so, in terms of social inequities, we're talking about access to healthcare or access to emergency services that were funded by the mine operations. And when we think about global impacts to industries, this mine in particular distributes again all their materials globally. So it has a huge impact on construction, on the construction industry, on traffic and road safety. Those materials are integrated into the materials that are put down on roads. We think about medical technology and how important it is to have metals that create the batteries and create the systems that we need to keep people alive. Um, and as also, additives that are benefits to the environment and agriculture sector. I mean, there are huge far-reaching effects when engagement on permitting is not done well. However, when permitting or meaningful engagement is done really, really well, we see a lot of community benefits and a lot of investment. So we see enhanced community trust and support, so that companies have continued social license and the ability to operate still in communities, informed decision making on both the community and the organization side. So, from the organization's point of view, they're able to better understand the risks and impacts and how to mitigate their risk and impacts on communities, um, being able to tailor their mitigations to the communities that they work with. Improved environmental stewardship. So a lot of times what we see is companies have some of the strictest, operating policies and regulations that they have to adhere to. So in terms of environmental stewardship, sometimes you see a huge increase in their sustainability practices because that's what is required of them, um, as well as significant changes to their mitigations and their accountability approaches and their measures. You see socioeconomic benefits in the region, so jobs come back. You also see funding for infrastructure come in, so roads and bridges that lead to schools, that lead to other healthcare facilities and emergency response um, equipment. So not just the transportation of ambulances and helicopters and whatever, but you see healthcare facilities and community buildings that come up where people can gather because a lot of these areas are in remote locations, or they don't have the same kind of access to health facilities and doctors like I do here in Maine, for example. And then of course you have this really interesting balance and respect for indigenous and cultural rights. So cultural preservation can absolutely happen and coexist with sustainable mining operations, especially when the benefits are shared or given to indigenous communities in the form of shareholder hire, community investments, but also just in general, when companies recognize that indigenous communities hold decision making power inherently, that respect, which is not something that you can touch, or it's not something that you can see, it's not tactile, but it's there. That makes, of course, the relationship building part of this and the community engagement part of this that much more smooth. Um, the last thing that I'll end on with this and why community engagement matters in things like this example of mining, is because when there is meaningful engagement on permitting conversations, you're also helping future generations kind of set up, you're laying the foundation for future generations to be able to create that just transition to other sustainable energies. The kind of work that I do, the kind of clients and communities that we work with, it's always messy. And if you're not willing to be a part of that change by having conversations and by really, I don't think a lot of people like to do this, but putting aside your ego to have meaningful conversations with communities and companies, if you're not able to do that, you're not going to get too far. So that's why, it's very important to make sure that you know the people, that you know the socioeconomic and political context of people that you're speaking with, and two, because if you can't connect with them and you can't lead with the relationship, then nothing else is going to matter. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I mean, obviously, I think that really is the framework and the approach that we're trying to take here with leading with relationship. Not trying to force people to be right and wrong, but to understand in our own communities and our own conversations where people are at and explain our thinking while also willing to understand theirs. We are so grateful for you making time, especially on a weekday evening, so late East Coast time, Emily. So know the conversation can continue. Feel free to click the link for all those that are on here to log your training. We'll post this as of tomorrow on YouTube. And just from our network to yours, Emily, thank you for the important work you're doing to really build out the ability for communities to weigh in and have the chance to engage on impactful projects and helping us think through how that can show up in our own advocacy. So I'm going to unmute all lines just so we have the chance to say thank you and, obviously appreciate you, Emily. And in the meantime, stay safe, everyone. And we look forward to continuing the discussion on the forums.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together,
We are creating the political will for a livable world.